A powerful 7.8 earthquake struck southern Philippines early Monday morning. The broadcast told you a tsunami warning was issued. Nobody interrupted the broadcast to mention the waves actually hit 4 countries, not 1 country. 4. The general coverage gave you the warning and stopped there, as if a warning were the whole story, as if the ocean had politely waited for officials to issue a statement before deciding whether to move. But the ocean did move. The seafloor 33 kilometres down off Sarangani lifted, and the water above it travelled. It travelled to the coasts of the Philippines, to the gauges off Sulawesi in Indonesia, to recording stations in Palau, and to monitoring points in Japan. The wave you were not told about peaked at 1.4 metres in a town called Kiamba. That is the part that was not said out loud. Stay with me, because the gap between what the broadcast said and what the gauges measured is the entire story. If this has you thinking, subscribe to Rupture, because we read the bulletins the evening news skips, and we tell you what the gauges actually measured, not just what the warning text said. Drop a comment below. When the broadcast told you a tsunami warning was issued, did anyone tell you that waves had already hit 4 countries? Part 1. The day the pattern locked. By the time the clock struck 7:37 a.m. on June 8, a fault 32 kilometres southwest of Marsim town had already shifted the seafloor beneath 722,000 people in General Santos city. The shaking arrived before most households had finished breakfast. Children walked to school. Market vendors were setting out the first crates of fish. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake does not announce itself. It arrives in a low rumble that turns within seconds into a sustained roll that pulls everything horizontal. By the time the shaking peaked, the United States Geological Survey, which is to say the federal agency that monitors seismic activity for the world, had already logged the event in its automated bulletin. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, which goes by the shorter name PHIVOLCS and serves as the national authority on earthquakes inside the Philippines, was running its own confirmation. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, headquartered in Hawaii and known by the initials PTWC, was reading the same signal and beginning its own calculation. 3 agencies, 3 independent confirmations, all within minutes. That is not coincidence. That is what a magnitude 7.8 earthquake looks like to instruments designed to catch it. The location was Sarangani Province, on the southern coast of Mindanao, the large island that forms the southern third of the Philippine archipelago. The epicenter sat offshore, about 32 kilometres southwest of the town of Marsim. The shaking carried inland and ran north into General Santos City, a port city of 722,000 people that serves as the commercial heart of southern Mindanao. A port worker in General Santos could see the building collapse from the dock. In General Santos, a building collapsed. The structure came down during the strongest portion of the ground motion, the section seismologists call the strong motion phase, which is to say the part of an earthquake when the ground is shaking hardest and structures are most likely to fail. People were inside. Rescue crews moved into the rubble within the hour. The official death toll climbed through the morning. By the time the first international wire reports were posted, the count stood at 41 dead and more than 200 injured. Those numbers are not final. They are the count as of the first 24 hours. Earthquakes of this size keep adding to their toll for days as crews reach buildings they could not reach at first, as landslides are cleared, as families report missing relatives who were caught on roads and in fields when the ground shifted. Let me walk you through what a 7.8 means in instrument terms, because the number alone does not tell you what your body would have felt. Magnitude 7.8 is a major earthquake. It is the same energy class as the 1994 Northridge event in California, which is to say the kind of shaking that brings down freeway overpasses and cracks open the foundations of homes. A 7. 8 releases about 32 times more energy than a magnitude 6.8, and about 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 5.8. The numbers feel small on the scale because the scale is logarithmic, which is to say each whole number step represents about 32 times more shaking energy than the step below it. The body does not feel it as a number. The body feels it as a roll that does not stop. Witnesses in General Santos described shaking that lasted close to a full minute. A full minute of major ground motion is long enough to bring down any building that was not engineered for it, and many in southern Mindanao were not. The initial USCA's bulletin put the depth at 55 kilometers. That number changed within hours. By the time PHIVOLCS issued its consolidated event report, PHIVOLCS refined the depth to 33 kilometers. A dock worker on the coast does not care about the bulletin language. He cares that the corrected number arrived before the boats went back out. The two figures are not contradictions. They are the normal sequence of a major earthquake bulletin. The first depth estimate is computed from the earliest arrivals at the nearest seismometers, which gives a fast number that is often too deep. The refined depth comes from the full waveform, from stations across the region, from the careful work of locating the rupture in 3 dimensions. 33 kilometers is the figure that matters. Hold that number in your head, because it is going to drive everything that happened in the water. The location matters as much as the magnitude. The Philippine Trench region, which is the long offshore fault system that runs along the eastern and southern edge of the archipelago, is one of the most active subduction zones on the planet. A subduction zone is the place where one tectonic plate is sliding under another. The Philippine Sea Plate and the Sunda Plate meet in this region, and the pressure that builds between them releases in earthquakes. Most release in small ones. Some, every few decades, release in the kind of event that moved the seafloor on Monday morning. The fault that broke is part of a system that has produced deadly tsunamis in living memory. We will return to that history. For now, hold the geography. The epicenter was offshore. The depth was 33 kilometers. The location was the southern Philippine Trench region. Those 3 facts together are what made the ocean move. The human cost arrived faster than the official statements. In General Santos, families were trying to reach relatives by phone. The mobile networks held in some places and dropped in others. Hospitals in the city received the injured throughout the morning. The collapsed building was one of several damaged structures, but it was the one that drew the rescue effort because the people inside were trapped under collapsed concrete. A mother in General Santos was photographed standing outside the rubble waiting for word about her son. That is not a story we are telling for colour. That is what a 7.8 looks like in human terms. One mother, one son, one building, and 41 confirmed dead by the end of the day, with the count still rising. In Sarangani province itself, the deaths came differently. The shaking triggered landslides on the steep terrain that backs the southern coast. Roads were cut. Communities along the coastal strip were isolated for hours while emergency crews worked to clear access. Displaced families gathered in evacuation centres as the tsunami warning was issued and they were told to move to higher ground. Most did. The decision to move saved lives in the coastal villages because the waves that arrived in the hours after the quake were measured, not just warned. We will get to those measurements in detail, but the people on the coast did not have measurements. They had a warning, and they moved. The USGS issued its official statement within 30 minutes of the event. PHIVOLCS followed with a consolidated bulletin that named the rupture, gave the depth, and confirmed the tsunami advisory. The PTWC issued its Pacific-wide assessment based on the magnitude, the depth, and the location, calculating the threat to coastlines beyond the Philippines. 3 agencies, working in parallel, agreeing on the core facts within an hour. That alignment is not a small thing. That is the global earthquake monitoring system doing what it was designed to do. When the alignment is fast and the agencies agree, you know the event is large enough and clean enough in its signal that the instruments could not miss it. A magnitude 7, 8 offshore thrust fault earthquake at 33 kilometers depth is not a signal that hides. It announced itself on every seismometer that was listening. But the announcement was only the first part. The next part was the water. And to understand what the water did, you have to understand what happened underneath it. So here is the question we leave this part with. What made this quake capable of sending a tsunami across 4 countries? Not just to the nearest coast, not just to one neighbouring shore. 4 countries. The Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, and Palau. A single offshore rupture, and waves measured across the western Pacific. The answer is in the depth, in the rupture type, and in the geometry of the seafloor that moved. Let me show you what the surface is hiding. Part 2. What the surface is hiding. Remember where we left it. The quake hit at 7:37 a.m. with a depth that changed from 55 kilometers to 33 kilometers. That change is not a correction in the sense of someone admitting a mistake. That change is the difference between a quake that mostly stays inside the Earth and a quake that lifts the seafloor. Let me show you why. 55 kilometers down is roughly 34 miles below the surface of the ocean. At that depth, an earthquake can still be felt strongly at the coast, but the rock above the rupture is so thick that the displacement of the seafloor is often small. The energy is real, but it dissipates through 34 miles of rock before it reaches the water. A 55-kilometer event is not the kind of quake that typically generates a damaging trans-ocean tsunami. It can generate local waves, but the cross-ocean reach is rare. 33 kilometers is a different animal. 33 kilometers is about 20 miles down. 20 miles is shallow enough that when the fault slips, the rock above the rupture can transmit the displacement upward to the seafloor with most of its energy intact. The seafloor itself moves, and when the seafloor moves, the water above it has to go somewhere. Let me put that depth in household terms. 20 miles is the distance from a downtown to a far suburb. It is a 30-minute drive on a clear highway. It is the distance a small plane covers in about 7 minutes. That is the distance between the rupture surface and the bottom of the ocean above it. Now imagine that distance vertically, with solid rock from top to bottom, and a sudden shift at the bottom of that column. The shift is small in human terms, on the order of meters, but it lifts everything above it. The rock above lifts, the seafloor above the rock lifts, and the water above the seafloor lifts, all the way up to the surface. That is how a deep earthquake makes a wave that crosses an ocean. The depth revision from 55 to 33 kilometers is the kind of detail that gets buried in the bulletin footnotes, but it is the single most important number in the entire event. If the depth had stayed at 55 kilometers, the tsunami advisory would still have been issued, but the wave heights at distant coasts would likely have been smaller. The fact that the rupture turned out to be at 33 kilometers is the reason the gauges in Indonesia and Palau and Japan registered the wave. The depth made the cross-ocean reach possible. That is not opinion. That is geometry. How does the depth refinement actually happen? The first bulletin from the USGS comes out of an automated system. The system reads the earliest arrivals at the nearest seismometers, runs a fast inversion, and produces a number. That number is good enough to issue a warning, but it is not the final answer. Within minutes to hours, additional stations report. The waveforms are read in full. Seismologists examine the depth phase, which is a specific seismic arrival that comes from the rupture reflecting off the surface of the Earth and coming back down. The depth phase gives a very precise depth estimate. By the time the depth phase is read, the number tightens. In this case, it tightened from 55 to 33. That is the system working as designed. Phivolcs issued its own depth determination using its own network, which is denser in the Philippines than the global USGS network. The Phivolcs depth was consistent with the refined USGS figure. 2 independent networks agreeing on 33 kilometers is what gives that number its weight. It is not one agency saying it. It is 2, using different stations, arriving at the same answer. The PTWC then uses the refined depth in its tsunami threat modelling, which is the calculation that tells coastal authorities how far and how high the wave is expected to reach. The PTWC model takes the magnitude, the depth, the location, and the rupture type, and it estimates the threat. The estimate for this event was a Pacific-wide threat assessment that flagged risk to coasts beyond the Philippines. Now hold the depth in your mind and let me show you what depth means for the water. A tsunami is not made by an earthquake shaking the water. A tsunami is made by an earthquake displacing the water. The shaking does not move enough water to matter. The displacement does. Displacement requires the seafloor to physically shift, vertically. If the seafloor lifts by 1 meter over an area the size of a county, the water above it has to lift by 1 meter over that same area. That lifted water then spreads out as a wave. The wave is not tall at the source. In the deep ocean, a tsunami is often less than a meter high, and ships at sea do not notice it passing under them. The wave is long, not tall. It carries enormous volumes of water in a wavelength that can stretch hundreds of kilometers. When that wave reaches shallow water at a coast, the front of the wave slows, the back of the wave catches up, and the water. That is how a meter-high wave in the open ocean becomes a 1.4 meter wave at a coastal gauge. Depth controls how much of the rupture's energy reaches the seafloor. Shallow ruptures, in the range of 10 to 35 kilometers, are the depth band that produces the largest tsunamis from thrust earthquakes. 33 kilometers sits inside that band. The 2004 Sumatra earthquake, which generated the Indian Ocean tsunami that killed more than 230,000 people, had a rupture depth of about 30 kilometers. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake off Japan, which generated the wave that overran the Fukushima coast, had a rupture depth of about 32 kilometers. Both events sit in the same depth range as the Monday quake. The magnitudes were larger, the geometry was different, but the depth band is the same. That is not a comparison meant to alarm. It is a comparison meant to tell you that 33 kilometers is the depth at which the seafloor moves cleanly, and the water above it moves with it. The household analogy is simple. If you push the bottom of a swimming pool, the water moves. If you push the bottom of a lake covered by 20 miles of rock, the lake still moves, because the rock transmits the push. But if you push the bottom of a lake covered by 34 miles of rock, the push gets absorbed by the rock before it reaches the water. The difference between 33 kilometers and 55 kilometers is the difference between the push reaching the lake and the push being absorbed. The seafloor moved. We know it moved. The gauges measured the movement of the water above it. The PHIVOLCS Bulletin and the USGES event page both list the depth at 33 kilometers in their final consolidated reporting. That is the figure of record. It is the figure the PTWC used in its modelling. It is the figure that explains why a quake in southern Mindanao sent waves to Japan and Palau and Indonesia. The depth was not a footnote. The depth was the mechanism. And yet, most of the broadcast coverage did not mention the depth refinement. The coverage said magnitude 7.8 and moved on. The depth was buried in technical bulletins that most viewers never see. That is the gap. That is the part the evening news did not give you. The magnitude told you it was a big earthquake. The depth told you it was a tsunami generating earthquake. Both numbers matter. Only one was reported loudly. The other was the one that mattered for the water. So here is the question we leave this part with. Was the seafloor pushed upward? And how much? Because if the seafloor was pushed upward by even a small amount over a wide area, the water above it had nowhere to go but outward. The next part is about the rupture itself, about what kind of earthquake this was, and why this specific kind of rupture generates the most powerful tsunamis the planet produces. Part 3. The subsurface signal. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology recorded the event as a thrust fault tectonic rupture, which is to say the seafloor moved upward and forced the water above it outward. That single sentence is the mechanism of the entire event. Every wave that hit every coast was generated by that upward motion. Let me show you what a thrust fault rupture is and why it is different from every other kind of earthquake. There are 3 primary types of fault motion. The first is strike slip. which is to say 2 blocks of rock sliding past each other horizontally. The San Andreas Fault in California is a strike-slip fault. When a strike-slip earthquake happens, the rock moves sideways, the seafloor barely lifts, even if the fault is offshore. Strike-slip earthquakes rarely make significant tsunamis because they do not displace water vertically. The second type is normal faulting, which is to say 1 block of rock dropping down relative to another. Normal faults open up. They can make tsunamis if they are offshore, but the tsunamis are usually smaller because the motion is downward, not upward. The third type is thrust faulting, which is to say 1 block of rock pushing up and over another. Thrust faults are the tsunami makers. When a thrust fault ruptures offshore, the upper block lifts, and the seafloor above it lifts with it. The water above the seafloor lifts, and then it spreads. The rupture on Monday was thrust fault. That is what Phivolcs recorded. That is what the USG's focal mechanism solution showed. A focal mechanism solution, in plain English, is a calculation that takes the recorded shaking at stations around the world and works backward to figure out which way the fault moved. The calculation produces a diagram that looks like a beach ball, and the pattern on the beach ball tells seismologists whether the rupture was strike-slip, normal, or thrust. For this event, the beach ball pattern showed thrust. The fault moved upward. The seafloor moved upward. The water above it had to go. Let me translate the term megathrust, because some of the coverage used it. A megathrust earthquake is a thrust fault rupture that occurs along the interface between 2 tectonic plates at a subduction zone. The Philippine Trench region is a subduction zone. The Philippine Sea Plate is being pushed under the Sunda Plate at this margin. When the locked portion of the interface releases, the upper plate snaps upward over the lower plate. That snap is the megathrust. Not every thrust earthquake is a megathrust. A megathrust is specifically the subduction interface rupture. The Monday event has been described in technical analyses as a thrust fault rupture along the Philippine Trench region subduction system, which is to say it was the megathrust type of motion, even if smaller in scale than the largest historical events. Why does this rupture type generate the most powerful tsunamis? 3 reasons, all geometric. First, the surface area of the rupture is large. A magnitude 7.8 thrust earthquake breaks a fault patch that can be 100 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. That is a rupture surface the size of a small US state. When that whole surface lifts, even by a meter or 2, the volume of water displaced is enormous. Second, the lift is vertical. The fault moves upward, not sideways, which means all of the displacement contributes to the wave. A horizontal motion of the same magnitude would generate almost no tsunami. Third, the rupture is at the right depth, shallow enough to reach the seafloor cleanly, deep enough to maintain coherence across the entire rupture surface. 33 kilometers depth on a thrust fault rupture in a subduction zone is the recipe for a tsunami that crosses borders. The household analogy is the bathtub. Imagine the bottom of a bathtub suddenly lifting at one end by a small amount. The water at that end rises. The rise spreads across the tub as a wave. The wave reaches the other end and runs up the wall. Now scale that up. Replace the bathtub with the Celebes Sea. Replace the small lift with a 33-kilometer deep rupture that lifted the seafloor over an area larger than the state of Connecticut. The wave that spread out of that lift had hundreds of kilometers of water to travel through, and it had the energy of a major thrust rupture pushing it from below. That wave reached Indonesia. That wave reached Palau. That wave reached Japan. That wave reached the coast of the Philippines itself. Same rupture. Same lift. The Phivolcs documentation is the credibility source for the rupture type inside the Philippines. Phivolcs is the national agency. Its instruments are dense in the southern Philippines. Its analysts have decades of experience with the Philippine Trench region. The USG's documentation is the credibility source globally. The USG's focal mechanism is computed from stations on every continent. When PHIVOLCS and USGs agree on the rupture type, the agreement is not a coincidence. It is two independent analyses converging on the same physical reality. Both agencies described the rupture as thrust fault. Both placed it on the Philippine Trench region fault system. Both identified the geometry that made the tsunami possible. There is a specific phrase to understand. The phrase is offshore thrust source. An offshore thrust source is a thrust fault that lies under the ocean rather than under land. The distinction matters because only offshore thrust faults can make tsunamis. A thrust fault under a mountain range can produce a major earthquake, but it cannot move ocean water because there is no ocean above it. The Sarangani rupture was offshore. The fault was under the sea. The lift was under the water. That is why a magnitude 7.8 became a 4-country tsunami event instead of a 1-country earthquake event. Let me show you the historical pattern of offshore thrust ruptures in this region. The 1976 Moro Gulf earthquake was an offshore thrust rupture in the same broader region. We will return to that event in detail. The 1990 Luzon earthquake, which killed more than 1,300 people, was a different fault type, more strike slip, and it did not generate a major tsunami. The difference between the 1976 event and the 1990 event was the rupture type. Same country, different faults, different tsunamis. The rupture type is the variable that determines whether the water moves. A piece of detail that did not make most of the coverage. The rupture surface of a magnitude 7.8 thrust earthquake takes about 30 to 60 seconds to break completely. The rupture does not happen instantaneously. The break starts at one point on the fault, the hypercenter, and propagates outward along the fault surface at speeds of a few kilometers per second. As the rupture propagates, each section of the fault lifts in turn. The seafloor above the propagating rupture lifts in sequence, generating a wave that has internal structure based on the rupture geometry. That is why some tsunamis arrive at coasts as a single large wave, and others arrive as a series of waves spaced minutes apart. The Monday event generated multiple wave arrivals at multiple coasts. The gauges show the structure. The structure tells you the rupture propagated. A farmer in coastal Sarangani, who was already up tending livestock when the shaking started, would have felt the ground roll for nearly a minute. He would have looked toward the sea and seen, at first, nothing. The tsunami warning would not yet have reached him. By the time the official advisory came out, the water at the shoreline was already beginning to behave strangely. In some places the sea drew back, exposing rocks and shallow flats that are normally underwater. That drawback is the wave's trough arriving first. The drawback is the warning the ocean itself gives. People who know the coast know that a sudden drawback means the wave is coming. People who do not know the coast sometimes walk out onto the exposed flats out of curiosity. The Monday event did not produce a long drawback at most coasts because the rupture was relatively close and the wave arrived quickly. But the principle is the same. The seafloor moved, the water followed, the mechanism is now in your hands. Magnitude 7.8. Thrust fault rupture. Offshore source. 33 kilometers depth, subduction interface in the Philippine Trench region. Each piece is a confirmed fact from PHIVOLCS and USG's documentation. Together, they explain everything about what happened in the water. The mechanism is the answer to the first question. The mechanism is what made the tsunami possible. So here is the question we leave this part with. Why does this rupture type generate the most powerful tsunamis? You now have the geometric answer. The next question is the measurement answer. 5 hours after the quake, the warning was officially downgraded, but the gauges had already recorded the waves. Let me show you what the gauges said. Part 4. The update that changes everything. 5 hours after the quake, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center said the threat largely passed, but the gauge in Kiamba town had already recorded a 1.4 meter wave. That sentence is the entire architecture of the gap. The threat passed. The wave already happened. Both statements are true. The institutional language of the threat passing is forward-looking. It means the wave has arrived, the maximum has been recorded, and additional dangerous waves are no longer expected. The institutional language is not saying nothing happened. The institutional language is saying it is over. But what happened during those 5 hours, between the rupture and the all clear, is the measured reality of the event. Let me show you what the gauges said. A tsunami gauge is a sensor installed at a coastal location that measures the height of the sea surface relative to a fixed reference. The gauge sits on a pier or a piling. It records the water level continuously. When a tsunami arrives, the gauge captures the wave's height with second-by-second resolution. The Pacific has a network of these gauges operated by national meteorological agencies, by harbour authorities, and by international tsunami warning systems. When a tsunami passes, the gauges produce a continuous record. The record is the truth of the event. The record cannot be edited by a broadcaster. The record cannot be softened by a press release. The record is the wave. The gauge in Kiamba town, on the southwestern coast of Mindanao, recorded a 1.4 metre wave. That is the peak of the event measured anywhere. 1.4 metres is approximately 4.6 feet. Picture a wave that comes ashore at the height of a kitchen counter, with the volume of water that backs a kitchen counter held flat across the length of a coast. That is what a 1.4 metre tsunami wave is. It is not a wall of water in the cinematic sense. It is a fast rise in the sea level that floods low ground, sweeps debris from the beach, and pushes seawater into structures that are not designed to keep it out. A 1.4 metre wave on a populated coast is a dangerous wave. It is exactly the size of wave that historically has killed people who did not move to higher ground in time. The general Philippine coast measurement reached approximately 1 metre. 1 metre is about 3.3 feet. The height of a tall toddler. The height of a kitchen counter at its low end. The height of a wave that floods the first floor of a beachfront structure and pulls outdoor furniture out to sea. 1 metre is the threshold above which the PTWC routinely issues evacuation advisories. The Philippine coast experienced 1 metre wave heights at multiple gauges, with the Kiamba peak as the maximum. The distribution of the wave heights tells you the geometry of the rupture and the direction of the energy. Kiamba sat in the direct path of the wave from the offshore source. Other coastal locations were at angles to the source and saw smaller heights. Off Sulawesi, in Indonesia, the gauge recorded 83 centimetres. 83 centimetres is approximately 2.7 feet. The height of a sturdy stool. The height of a wave that floods low coastal roads and pushes salt water into agricultural fields that abut the shore. Sulawesi sits across the Celebes Sea from southern Mindanao. The wave crossed open water to reach Sulawesi. The crossing took hours. The gauge in Sulawesi captured the wave with the timestamp of arrival, and the timestamp shows the wave travelled from the Sarangani rupture across the Celebes Sea at the standard tsunami propagation speed in deep water, which is to say several hundred kilometres per hour. The wave did not lose all of its energy in the crossing. 83 centimetres in Sulawesi is the energy that survived the trip. In Palau, the gauge recorded 30 centimetres. 30 centimetres is approximately 1 foot. The height of a small step. The height of a wave that flushes through shallow lagoons, raises water levels in harbours, and produces strong currents that can drag swimmers and small boats. Palau sits to the east of the Philippines, in the western Pacific. The wave reached Palau by travelling across the Philippine Sea. The 30 centimetre reading at the Palau gauge is the energy that survived an even longer crossing than the Sulawesi reading. 30 centimetres is small in human terms, but it is the kind of small that confirms the wave crossed an ocean. Energy that travels that far and still moves the surface by a foot is energy that started with a major rupture. In Japan, the wave was recorded at multiple gauges along the southern coastline that faces the western Pacific. The Japanese gauge readings were smaller than those in Indonesia and the Philippines, but were detected in the official tide gauge records. Japan's network of tsunami gauges is dense and well calibrated. When the Japanese gauges register a wave from a southern Philippines source, the registration confirms the wave crossed the entire western Pacific. Now let me give you the verdict on what the gauges said. They measured 1 meter in the Philippines. They measured 83 centimeters in Indonesia. They measured 30 centimeters in Palau. 3 measurements. 3 countries. 1 rupture. The numbers are not estimates. The numbers are not model outputs. The numbers are gauge readings, recorded continuously by instruments calibrated to international standards, archived in the data centers of the national agencies that operate them, available to any researcher or journalist who knows how to ask. The gauges measured the wave. The wave was real. The wave reached 4 countries. The PTWC's 5-hour assessment that the threat had largely passed was correct in the institutional sense, which is to say no additional dangerous waves were expected after that point. But the gauges had already done their work. The wave had already arrived at every coast it was going to reach. The household scale comparison for these wave heights is important. 1 meter is a wave the height of a toddler. 83 centimeters is the height of a child of about 3 years old standing up. 30 centimeters is the height from your ankle to about mid-shin. None of these are walls of water. None of these are the cinematic tsunami of the 2004 Indian Ocean or the 2011 Tohoku. But all of these are heights that, on a populated coast, move boats, flood low ground, and represent the measured signature of a transoceanic event. The smallness of the heights at distant coasts is the proof of the largeness of the event at the source. The wave travelled. The wave lost most of its energy to the crossing, and it still moved the surface by a foot in Palau and by nearly 3 feet in Indonesia. That is the measured reality. Why did the biggest wave hit Kiamba? Geography. Kiamba sits on the southwestern coast of Mindanao, on the inner side of a bay that opens toward the Celebes Sea. The rupture was offshore, southwest of Marsim, and the wave that propagated outward from the rupture had a direct, unobstructed path into the bay that Kiamba sits inside. Bays focus tsunamis. The wave enters a bay, the bay narrows, the water has nowhere to spread, and the height increases as the wave is funneled toward the coast. Kiamba's bay configuration is the kind of geography that produces local peaks. Other coastal locations had wider exposures and smaller heights. Kiamba had the focusing geometry. Kiamba got the 1.4 meter peak. A specific human zoom. A coastal resident in Kiamba who was watching the bay in the hour after the quake would have seen the water draw back, then return as a fast surge that came up over the seawall and into the streets. Boats that were tied at the pier would have lifted, swung, and in some cases broken loose. Anything stored on low ground near the shore would have moved with the water. That is what a 1.4 meter wave does. That is what the gauge in Kiamba recorded, in real time, as the wave arrived. The instrument did not interpret the event. The instrument measured it. So here is the question we leave this part with. Why did the biggest wave hit Kiamba? You now have part of the answer. The geography of the bay focused the wave. The next part is about the broader path, about how a single offshore rupture sent waves across the Celebes Sea, the Philippine Sea, and onward to Japan and Palau. Let me show you the path the water took. Part 5. The Cross-Ocean Path. Let me show you the path the water took. It started off Sarangani and crossed the Celebes Sea to Indonesia, then spread toward Japan and Palau. The path is not a metaphor. The path is the actual physical route of the wave through the Western Pacific, measured by the timing of arrivals at successive gauges. When a tsunami crosses an ocean, the wave does not travel in a single direction. It radiates outward from the source in all directions, with the strongest energy in the direction perpendicular to the rupture. The Sarangani rupture, oriented along the Philippine Trench region, sent its strongest energy outward at right angles to the fault line. That direction included the Celebes Sea to the southwest, the broader Philippine Sea to the east, and the coasts of multiple nations along those paths. The Celebes Sea is the body of water between the southern Philippines and the northern coast of Sulawesi, Indonesia. It is roughly 500 kilometers across at its widest point. The wave that left Sarangani crossed this sea at typical tsunami propagation speeds. In deep water, a tsunami travels at the square root of the product of gravitational acceleration and water depth. For the Celebes Sea, with depths reaching 5,000 meters or more in the central basin, the wave speed is on the order of 700 to 800 kilometers per hour. That is the cruising speed of a commercial passenger jet. The wave covered the distance to Sulawesi in roughly 2 hours. The gauge in Sulawesi recorded the arrival, recorded the 83-centimeter peak, and recorded the secondary waves that followed. That is not a wave behavior most people understand. That is a wave that travels at airliner speed across thousands of kilometers of open ocean without anyone on a ship noticing it pass. A tsunami in deep water is so long, so flat, and so spread out that vessels at sea register only a slight rise and fall. The wave is invisible until it reaches shallow water. Then the energy compresses, the height grows, and the wave that was invisible in the deep ocean becomes the wave that floods a coast. That transition from deep to shallow is what makes tsunamis so dangerous. There is no warning visible from the sea itself. There is only the gauge data, the seismic data, and the model outputs from the warning centres. The eastern path from the Sarangani rupture crossed the Philippine Sea toward Palau and onward toward Japan. The Philippine Sea is larger than the Celebes Sea, with depths exceeding 9,000 meters in the Philippine Trench itself. The wave speed across the deepest sections approaches 1,000 kilometers per hour. The wave reached Palau, recorded as 30 centimeters, and continued onward. It reached the Japanese gauges at smaller amplitudes after the longer crossing. The arrival times at each gauge matched the predicted propagation times for a tsunami originating at the Sarangani rupture location. The match is the proof that the source was the source. The gauge data is not ambiguous about the origin. A reference point for the timing. The New York Times maintained a tracker for the event that mapped the propagation across the Western Pacific. The tracker, based on the same propagation models used by the PTWC, showed the wave expanding outward from the Sarangani source and reaching each successive coast at the predicted time. The tracker is a visual representation of what the gauges measured. The gauges are the truth. The tracker is a way to see the truth on a map. Both confirm the same path. Let me put the cross-ocean reach in household terms. Imagine dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripple spreads outward in a circle. Now imagine the pond is the Western Pacific Ocean, the stone is a rupture the size of a small US state, lifting by a meter, and the ripple is a wave that travels at the speed of a passenger jet for hours across thousands of kilometers. The ripple still reaches the edge of the pond. It is smaller by the time it reaches the far shore. But it reaches, and when it reaches, the gauges measure it. That is the cross-ocean path. That is what one offshore rupture in southern Mindanao did to the waters of 4 nations. The 4-country reach is not a common outcome of magnitude 7.8 earthquakes. Most magnitude 7.8 events do not produce measurable tsunamis at distant coasts. The events that do share specific characteristics. They are offshore. They are thrust fault. They are at the right depth. They are in a geometry that sends energy across open water rather than absorbing it into land. The Monday event had all of those characteristics. The 4-country reach is not luck. The 4-country reach is the geometric outcome of a thrust rupture at 33 kilometers depth offshore of Sarangani. Let me address what the 4-country reach tells you that the single-country headline does not. A single-country tsunami can be caused by a moderate local source. A 4-country tsunami requires a major source. The reach is the proof of the magnitude. If you only saw the Philippine impact, you might conclude that this was a regional event of regional consequence. The Indonesian, Palawan, and Japanese gauge readings tell you it was a Pacific event with implications beyond the source country. The energy escaped the source region. The energy crossed open water. The energy was measured at international gauges. A specific consequence at the destination coasts. In Sulawesi, the 83-centimetre wave arrived at multiple coastal communities. Fishing boats that had been tied at piers lifted with the surge. Some broke loose. Coastal roads near the gauge location experienced minor flooding. The Indonesian Disaster Management Agency confirmed the wave arrivals and posted advisories. No major casualties were reported at the destination coasts. The reason no casualties were reported is that the warning system worked. The PTWC bulletin was issued. The national agencies in Indonesia and Palau and Japan received the bulletin. The coastal communities were notified. People moved to higher ground where movement was required. The warning system, despite the criticisms it sometimes receives, did what it is designed to do. The wave arrived. People were not in the path. This is a place to pause and acknowledge something. The 41 deaths in the Philippines were caused by the earthquake itself, primarily the building collapse in General Santos City and the landslides in Sarangani. The deaths were not caused by the tsunami. The tsunami arrived in the Philippines as well, including the 1.4-metre peak at Kiamba, but the coastal evacuation and the warning system limited casualties from the wave itself. That is an important distinction. The earthquake killed, the tsunami arrived, the warning system protected. All three are true. The story of the wave is not a story of mass casualties at the destination coasts. The story of the wave is a story of measurable reach and confirmed geometry. The wave hit 4 countries. The wave was real. The wave is what the broadcast did not tell you. So here is the question we leave this part with. What does the 4-country reach tell us about the energy of this rupture? You now have the propagation answer. The wave travelled at jet speed across thousands of kilometres and was measured at gauges in 4 nations. That reach is the signature of a major event. The next part is about what history says about ruptures of this kind on this fault. Because this is not the first time the Philippine Trench region has moved. And the last time was worse. Part 6. The history that returns. Remember the question we left. The 4-country reach shows great energy. The history shows what that energy can do. On August 17, 1976, an earthquake of magnitude 7.9 ruptured a fault in the Moro Gulf off the western coast of Mindanao. The rupture was offshore. The depth was shallow. The fault type was thrust. The geometry was similar to the geometry of the Monday event. The earthquake generated a tsunami. The tsunami struck the coasts of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago in the night. The death toll was approximately 8,000. 8,000 people. Let me hold that number with you for a moment. 8,000 is the population of many small American towns. It is the head count of a mid-sized college. It is more people than fit in most US high school football stadiums. 8,000 people died in a single night in 1976 because the seafloor moved and the wave came ashore in the dark, and the warning systems of that era did not give the coastal communities enough time to move. The 1976 Moro Gulf earthquake remains one of the deadliest tsunami events in Philippine history. It is the historical comparison case for any major offshore thrust rupture in the southern Philippines. 8,000 people is more than the population of many small American towns. One offshore rupture killed them all. The mechanism in 1976 was the same as the mechanism on Monday. An offshore thrust fault rupture in a Philippine subduction zone. The seafloor lifted, the water moved, the wave reached the coast. The difference in outcome between 1976 and 2025 is not a difference in mechanism, it is a difference in warning infrastructure, in coastal awareness, in the speed of communication, and in the protocols that move people away from the shore when the gauges start to register. The mechanism is unchanged. The fault is unchanged. The geography is unchanged. The death toll is different, because the response system has been built over the decades since. Let me show you what the response system looks like and why it matters. In 1976, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center existed, but the network of gauges in the region was sparse. Coastal communications were limited. Many of the affected villages had no radio contact with regional authorities. The wave arrived in the dark, with no warning, and destination coasts reported no major casualties from the wave. In 2025, the PTWC issued its bulletin within minutes of the quake. FIVOLCS issued domestic advisories on a national broadcasting system. Mobile alerts went out across affected provinces. Coastal communities had received tsunami evacuation drills in the years prior. The wave still arrived. The wave still measured 1.4 meters at Kiamba, but the wave did not find populated low ground unprepared. The death count from the wave at the destination coasts was minimal. The warning system held. This is not a story about how everything is fine now. This is a story about how the same fault is still capable of the same destruction, and how the difference between 8 Dormolo dead and a few coastal casualties is the difference between a warning that arrives in time and a warning that does not. The 1976 event is a baseline. The 2025 event is a measurement against that baseline. The fault is the same fault, in the broader sense. The Philippine Trench region has not stopped accumulating strain. It will release again. The question is not whether. The question is when, and how big, and how prepared. Let me show you what the historical record says about the recurrence interval of major thrust earthquakes in this region. The Philippine Trench region has produced magnitude 7.5 or larger earthquakes at irregular intervals over the past century. The 1976 Moro Gulf event. The 1990 Luzon event, though on a different fault type. Various smaller magnitude 7 events along the trench. The recurrence interval is not a clock. The fault does not release on a schedule. The fault releases when the accumulated strain exceeds the locking strength of the interface. The strain accumulates at the rate of the plate motion, which is several centimeters per year. The locking strength varies along the fault. Some sections release more often in smaller events. Some sections lock for longer and release in larger events. The 1976 event was a large release. The 2025 event is a major release, but smaller than 1976 in terms of fault area and energy. Other sections of the trench remain locked. Other releases are possible. A specific household scale analogy for what this means. Imagine a rubber band stretched between 2 posts. The band is being pulled tighter by a fraction of a millimeter every year. Eventually, the band reaches a point where it cannot stretch any further, and it snaps. The snap releases the stored energy. After the snap, the remaining band is shorter, and the pull resumes. The band will reach its next snap point eventually, but the timing depends on how much of the original strain was released in the previous snap, and how strong the remaining sections are. The Philippine Trench region is the rubber band. The 1976 snap was a big release. The 2025 snap is another release. The band is still being pulled. The next snap is coming. We do not know when, but we know it is coming, because the plate motion has not stopped. That is not weather. That is a system telling you something has broken before, will break again, and is being held back only by the slow accumulation of strain against the locking of rock against rock. The 1976 event has a specific human zoom that historians have preserved. The town of Cotabato, on the western coast of Mindanao, was struck by the tsunami in the early morning hours. Survivors described the sound of the wave before they saw it. The sound came across the water as a low roar. By the time the residents understood what they were hearing, the wave was at the door. Entire neighbourhoods along the shoreline were swept. Crews recovered bodies for days. Families who had moved inland in the hours after the quake survived. Families who had remained at the shore did not. The 1976 event taught the southern Philippines what an offshore thrust rupture can do. The lesson has been institutionalized. The lesson is why the 2025 evacuation orders moved people to higher ground in time. Let me put the historical death toll in a frame the American viewer can hold. The 1976 Moro Gulf tsunami killed about 8,000 people in a single night. That is more than the total death toll of the 2017 Las Vegas mass shooting multiplied by 138. That is more than the population of Beverly Hills, California. That is roughly the total US military death toll across the entire Iraq War. One offshore rupture in 1976 killed all of them in a few hours. The mechanism is the same mechanism that operated on Monday. The fault system is the same fault system. The geography is the same geography. The reason 2025 did not produce a similar toll at the coast is not that the fault has become less dangerous. The reason is that the warning system has become faster. So here is the question we leave this part with. What does this parallel tell us about the risk along this fault? You now have the historical answer. The fault has killed before. The fault is capable of killing again. The fault is currently active in a major event. The next part is about the geometry of the fault itself, about the Philippine Trench region as a system, about what it has done and what it can still do. Let me show you the fault line beneath. Part 7. The fault line beneath. The fault that broke is part of the Philippine Trench region, a long offshore thrust system that has generated deadly tsunamis in living memory. The Philippine Trench region is a subduction zone, which is to say a place where one tectonic plate is being forced under another at a rate of several centimeters per year. The descending plate is the Philippine Sea Plate. The overriding plate is the Sunda Plate. The interface between them is the fault. The interface is not a single straight line. It is a curving surface that follows the geometry of the descending plate, dipping from near the surface at the trench to deep beneath the Philippine landmass. Let me translate that. Imagine a sheet of paper being pushed under another sheet of paper at an angle. The descending sheet bends downward. The interface between the two sheets is the fault. As the descending sheet bends, friction along the interface holds it locked. The locking is not uniform. Some sections of the interface lock strongly and accumulate strain. Other sections slip continuously and release strain slowly. The locked sections are the sections that produce major earthquakes when they finally release. The slipping sections produce smaller, more frequent events that do not pose the same tsunami risk. The Philippine Trench is one of the deepest oceanic trenches on the planet, reaching depths greater than 10, 0.00 meters in its deepest sections. The trench marks the surface expression of the fault interface. The interface itself extends from the trench inland and downward, beneath the Philippine archipelago. The fault is hundreds of kilometers long. Different sections of the fault can rupture independently. The 1976 Moro Gulf rupture was on one side. The 2025 Sarangani rupture was on a related section. The full length of the trench is capable of segmented release, with each segment producing its own major event when its strain reaches threshold. Why does offshore thrust generate large tsunamis? We covered the answer in part 3, but let me reinforce it here with the specific Philippine Trench geometry. The descending Philippine Sea Plate dips at an angle of roughly 30 to 50 degrees beneath the overriding plate. When the locked section of the interface releases, the overriding plate snaps upward over the descending plate. The snap is the rupture. The snap lifts the seafloor above the rupture. The seafloor lift displaces the water above it. The water spreads as a tsunami. The geometry of the Philippine Trench, with its steep dip and its shallow upper interface, produces some of the cleanest tsunami-generating ruptures on the planet. When this region breaks, it breaks in a way that moves water. PHIVOLCS maintains a continuous instrumentation network across the Philippine Trench region. The network includes broadband seismometers, GPS stations, and ocean bottom pressure sensors. The seismometers record shaking. The GPS stations record the slow accumulation of strain at the surface. The ocean bottom pressure sensors record any vertical movement of the seafloor that might indicate a slow slip event or an impending rupture. The combination of these measurements gives PHIVOLCS a continuous picture of the state of the fault. The picture is not a prediction. The picture is a state of stress, updated continuously, that informs the warning system. The USCAS maintains the global seismic monitoring network that overlaps with PHIVOLCS for major events. The USCAS Earthquake Hazards Program operates the National Earthquake Information Center, which is the agency that issued the bulletin for the Monday event. The bulletin is the product of automatic detection systems, followed by analyst review, and integrated into the Global Earthquake Catalogue. The USCS Catalogue is the authoritative record of the event. The PHIVOLCS Catalogue is the authoritative record from the Philippine national perspective. Both catalogues list the same event with the same parameters. The agreement is the proof of the data quality. Let me give you a household analogy for the trench fault system. Imagine a long door that has been wedged shut by years of swelling wood. The door is the fault. The wedge is the locked section. The pressure pushing the door open is the plate motion. The door cannot move while the wedge holds. But every few years, a section of the wedge gives way, and that section of the door snaps open. The other sections remain wedged. Eventually, every section will give way, but the timing of each section is independent. The Philippine Trench is a long door. Some sections snapped in 1976, other sections snapped on Monday, other sections remain wedged. The door is being pushed. The wedges will give. Is this fault now more active? That question depends on what you mean by active. The fault has not changed its rate of plate motion. The plate is still descending at the same speed it has been descending for millions of years. What has changed is the state of strain on the interface. A major release like the Monday event reduces the strain on the section that ruptured, but it can increase the stress on adjacent sections. This is called stress transfer. When one section of a fault breaks, the rock around it adjusts, and some of the strain that was carried by the broken section is now carried by the surrounding sections. The surrounding sections can move closer to their own rupture threshold. That is why the next 24 to 72 hours matter. Aftershocks are the small adjustments of the fault and the surrounding rock as the system finds its new equilibrium after the main rupture. Aftershocks can be felt for days, weeks, sometimes months. Most aftershocks are smaller than the main event. Some can approach the main event's magnitude. The USGs and PHIVOLCS will be monitoring the aftershock sequence closely. The largest aftershock in the next 3 days will tell seismologists whether the main rupture released the full accumulated strain on that section, or whether additional large releases are possible. A specific human zoom for what this means at the coast. Coastal residents in Sarangani and Davao who experienced the main shock on Monday morning will continue to feel aftershocks. Some of those aftershocks will be felt as moderate shaking. Some will be felt only as a gentle roll. A small fraction will be large enough to trigger additional tsunami evaluations. Each of these will be assessed individually by PHIVOLCS and the PTWC. The coastal communities have been told to remain alert. They have been told that the all clear from the main event does not mean the fault is finished. They have been told to be ready to move again if the gauges register a new wave. That is not the story. That is the announcement of the story. The story is the fault itself and what the fault is capable of doing in the years and decades ahead. The Monday event is one release. The 1976 event was a different release. The fault as a whole has not been quiet, and it will not become quiet. The southern Philippines sit above one of the most active subduction zones on Earth, and the people who live along its coast live with the geology under their feet. So here is the question we leave this part with. Is this fault now more active, and what will the next 24 to 72 hours show? You now have part of the answer. The fault has released a major rupture. The aftershock sequence will refine our understanding of how much strain was released and how much remains. The next part is about the human map of the impact, about who was where and what they experienced, and what their stories tell us about which systems are most at risk. Let me walk you through 4 places. Part 8, the human impact map. Let me walk you through 4 places. Each one saw a different system affected by the same quake and the same wave. The first place is General Santos City. Population 722,000, the largest urban area in the southern Philippine impact zone. General Santos sits inland from the coast, on the shore of Sarangani Bay, with the bulk of the city set back from the shoreline on slightly elevated terrain. The earthquake reached the city as a sustained roll lasting close to a minute. The strong motion phase brought down a building in the city, with deaths and injuries reported. Hospitals in General Santos received the injured from the building collapse and from other minor structural failures across the city. The mobile network strained under the load of family calls in the hour after the quake. Power was interrupted in sections of the city, with restoration over the following hours. The city's water system was checked for damage. Schools were closed. The city's main port, which handles a significant share of southern Philippine maritime commerce, was inspected for tsunami damage and reopened after assessment. What the General Santos story tells you is that a magnitude 7.8 shaking event in a city of 722,000 produces a wide range of impacts beyond the single dramatic building collapse. Sections of utility infrastructure were stressed. Communication networks were stressed. The transportation system was paused. Public services were paused. All of these systems recovered within hours, but the recovery required the coordinated action of municipal authorities, utility crews, hospital staff, and emergency responders. A household scale comparison is this. A magnitude 7.8 in a mid-sized American city would mean an entire metropolitan area of more than 700,000 people pausing all major activity for the duration of the event and the immediate aftermath, with infrastructure systems being checked one by one before normal operations resumed. That is what General Santos did on Monday. The second place is Sarangani province, outside the city. Population spread across coastal villages and inland communities. This is where the landslides happened. The shaking destabilized slopes along the steep terrain that backs the southern coast. Roads were cut by debris. Some villages were isolated for hours while crews worked to clear access. Displaced families gathered in evacuation centres. The tsunami warning prompted coastal villagers to move to higher ground. Most did. The villages that experienced the largest wave heights, including the Kiamba area, had evacuated their low-ground populations before the wave arrived. The combination of landslide deaths and earthquake-related casualties accounts for a significant portion of the overall 41 dead and 200 injured count. What the Sarangani story tells you is that the rural population in the immediate epicentral region faced the most direct danger from the event. Landslides on shaking terrain are a primary cause of casualties in mountainous earthquake zones. The evacuation orders were complicated by road closures. The tsunami warning required movement to higher ground at the same time that landslides were blocking the routes inland. Rural emergency response is slower than urban emergency response, because the distances are greater and the infrastructure is less dense. Sarangani held. The local response was rapid by the standards of rural disaster response, but the toll in human terms was real. A household scale picture. A family in a coastal Sarangani village that had been told in past years about tsunami evacuation procedures heard the shaking, saw the sea behave strangely, and moved inland with their children and the few possessions they could carry. They made it to higher ground before the wave reached the shore. Their house was flooded by the wave. Their boat, which represented their family's primary income source, was damaged. But they survived. That story repeated itself across dozens of coastal villages. The training paid off. The cost of recovery for individual families will be measured in months of work to rebuild what the water damaged. The cost is real. The lives, in most cases, were saved. The third place is Sulawesi, Indonesia. The northern coast of Sulawesi sits across the Celebes Sea from the Sarangani rupture. The gauge at the northern Sulawesi coast recorded the 83-centimetre wave. Coastal communities along the affected stretch received Indonesian national tsunami advisories. Local authorities moved low-lying populations to higher ground. Fishing boats were secured where possible, though some broke loose during the surge. Coastal roads experienced minor flooding. Agricultural land along the immediate shoreline received saltwater intrusion that will affect short-term cropping. No major casualties were reported from the wave at the destination coast. What the Sulawesi story tells you is that an 83-centimeter tsunami at a foreign coast, generated by an offshore rupture in another country, produces measurable economic and infrastructural impacts even when it does not produce a major casualty count. Boats are lost, fields are salted, roads are flooded. The Indonesian National Disaster Management Agency, which goes by the acronym BNPB, posted advisories and coordinated the local response. The response confirmed that the warning system works internationally. A rupture in the Philippines triggered alerts in Indonesia within minutes. The alerts reached the coastal communities in time. The wave arrived, was measured, and the response held. The household scale picture for Sulawesi. A fishing family on the northern coast of Sulawesi heard the Indonesian National Advisory through mobile alerts. The family moved inland to higher ground with their children. Their boat, tied at the village pier, lifted during the surge and pulled at its moorings. The boat held. Other boats in the same harbour broke loose and were carried short distances. The family returned to find their pier damaged, their boat intact, and saltwater in the lower part of their property. The damage will be paid for from family savings and from any disaster relief that reaches the village. They survived. The wave reached them. Every advisory reached its coast. The fourth place is Palau. The Palauan gauge recorded a 30-centimeter wave. Palau is a small island nation in the western Pacific, east of the Philippines, with a population of roughly 18,000. The Palauan coast is dotted with lagoons and shallow harbours. A 30-centimeter wave in these geometries produces strong currents in the lagoons and in the harbour entrances. Boats in the harbours experience significant movement. Swimmers were advised to leave the water. The Palawan National Emergency Management Office issued advisories, and the impacts were minimal, though monitored throughout the wave passage. What the Palau story tells you is that even a wave that arrives at a small height can produce dangerous currents in specific geometries. 30 centimetres is not a flood. 30 centimetres is a moving current of seawater that drags swimmers, swings boats, and changes the water level in harbours faster than the normal tide allows. Palau's response system received the PTWC bulletin and acted on it. The 30-centimetre reading is the smallest of the 4-country wave heights, but it is still a measurement. It is still a confirmed reach. The Pacific is connected, and the connection includes Palau. The household scale picture for Palau. A diver who was scheduled to enter the water for a morning charter heard the advisory and stayed ashore. A harbour master watched the gauges and the visible water level for several hours after the predicted arrival. Boats remained in their slips. The visible water level rose and fell over the course of the wave passage. By mid-afternoon, the advisories had been lifted, the boats resumed operation, and the daily rhythm of the island returned. Nothing dramatic happened. The wave was measured. The infrastructure paid its cost. That is the story at most distant coasts when the warning system holds. Across these 4 places, the systems affected were different in each location. Urban infrastructure in General Santos, rural roads and slopes in Sarangani, fishing economies and coastal roads in Sulawesi, harbour currents and diving operations in Palau. All 4 were impacted by the same quake and the same wave. All 4 held. The casualties were concentrated at the epicentre, primarily from the building collapse and the landslides. Not from the wave at distant coasts. The 4-country reach of the wave was measured by gauges, not by mass casualty counts. That is the difference between 1976 and 2025. The reach is the same. The toll is different. So here is the question we leave this part with. Which system is most at risk if this fault breaks again? The answer depends on which section of the fault breaks, on the depth of the rupture, on the time of day. But the human map you now have shows you that the systems most exposed are the rural coastal communities closest to the source, and the urban infrastructure that sits on the shaking terrain. The systems that held best were those with the most preparation. The next part is about the next 24 to 72 hours, about what the agencies will refine and what the aftershock sequence will reveal. Let me show you the aftershock clock. Part 9. The aftershock clock. Over the next 24 to 72 hours, the USGs and PTWC will refine the depth, the aftershock size, and the remaining coastal risk. That window of 24 to 72 hours, which is to say 1 to 3 days, is the standard scientific assessment window for a major earthquake. During this window, additional seismic data accumulates, additional gauge measurements are processed, additional satellite observations are made, and the agencies update their event analysis with the refined information. The Monday event is now inside that window. The updates will arrive in stages, with the most consequential refinements typically coming within the first 48 hours. What gets refined in this window? 3 primary things. First, the depth. We discussed in Part 2 how the initial depth estimate of 55 kilometres was refined to 33 kilometres within hours. That refinement is based on the depth phase analysis and the integration of waveforms from distant stations. The refinement can continue in smaller increments as additional stations report and as the full waveform inversion is completed. The depth could move by a kilometre or 2 in either direction as the analysis matures. The 33-kilometre figure is the working value and is unlikely to change dramatically, but small refinements are normal. Second, the aftershock size and frequency. Aftershocks follow a statistical pattern called Omori's law, which is to say the rate of aftershocks decays over time in a predictable manner. The first 24 hours after a major earthquake typically produce the largest number of aftershocks, with the rate decreasing through subsequent days. The largest aftershock is typically about 1 magnitude unit smaller than the main shock, which for a magnitude 7.8 main event would suggest a largest aftershock around magnitude 6.8. That is still a major earthquake in its own right. The actual largest aftershock can be larger or smaller than this statistical expectation. The USG's aftershock forecast will be updated daily as the actual sequence unfolds. PHIVOLCS will issue parallel updates for the domestic audience. Third, the remaining coastal risk. The PTWC's 5-hour all-clear assessment indicated that no additional dangerous waves were expected from the main rupture. But if a large aftershock occurs offshore, that aftershock could generate its own tsunami. The PTWC will monitor each aftershock and issue a new bulletin if any aftershock is large enough and located in a position to generate a wave. The coastal communities have been told to remain alert. The all-clear for the main event is not an all-clear for the aftershock sequence. The two are tracked separately. The community must be prepared to respond to a new advisory if one is issued. Let me translate the time frame in household terms. 24 hours is 1 day. 48 hours is 2 days. 72 hours is 3 days. The window of refinement is 1 to 3 days. By the time you watch this part of the script unfold in real time, depending on when you are watching, you may already be inside the window of refinement or past it. The agencies post their updates publicly on their websites. The USG's event page is updated continuously. The PHIVOLCS event page is updated as the domestic situation evolves. The PTWC bulletins are archived on their website. Any viewer who wants to track the refinements in real time can do so by visiting these agency pages. What the aftershock clock tells you about the broader situation. Aftershocks are not separate events that happen after the main earthquake. Aftershocks are the continuation of the main rupture's adjustment process. The main rupture released most of the strain on the fault patch that broke. The surrounding rock then adjusts, slipping in smaller events to redistribute the residual stress. That redistribution can take days to weeks for the largest aftershocks and months to years for the smaller ones. The aftershock sequence of a magnitude 7.8 typically produces felt aftershocks for several weeks. The coastal communities will live with the aftershock sequence for that period. Some will be felt at the coast. Most will be felt only as faint rolls. None should be larger than the main event, statistically speaking, but the statistics are probabilities, not guarantees. A specific human zoom for what living through an aftershock sequence is like. A resident of General Santos City whose home was undamaged in the main event will feel several aftershocks over the next 72 hours. Each aftershock is a small reminder of the main event. Each aftershock requires a moment of attention to determine whether it is small enough to ignore or large enough to require action. Sleeping with the awareness of an active aftershock sequence is its own kind of fatigue. Families with children will need to manage anxiety. Workers returning to damaged structures will need to be cautious about secondary collapses. Schools that reopen will conduct earthquake drills. The week after a major earthquake is not a return to normal. It is a managed continuation of the event, with the aftershock clock running in the background of every activity. The USGs will issue an aftershock forecast that estimates the probability of aftershocks of various sizes over the next day, week, and month. The forecast is updated as the actual sequence unfolds. The forecast is not a prediction, it is a probabilistic assessment based on the statistics of aftershock sequences following earthquakes of similar magnitude in similar tectonic settings. The forecast can give a coastal community a sense of what to prepare for. The forecast does not say a specific aftershock will happen at a specific time. The forecast says, given the data, the probability of an aftershock of size X in the next time period is Y. That is the operational tool used by the warning system. PHIVOLCS will issue its own assessment using its own statistical models, calibrated to the Philippine seismicity. The two assessments will overlap in their core conclusions, with small variations based on the input parameters and the modelling assumptions. The convergence of the assessments is the proof of the data quality. The agencies will agree on the broad picture even if they differ in the specific numbers. What will the next update show about aftershock size? The honest answer is that we do not know yet. The next update will show what the data shows. If the largest aftershock to that point is in the magnitude 5.5 to 6.5 range, the assessment will conclude that the aftershock sequence is unfolding within the statistical expectation. If the largest aftershock to that point is in the magnitude 6.8 to 7.2 range, the assessment will conclude that the sequence is at the upper end of expectation, with implications for additional large aftershocks. If the largest aftershock is unusually small for the main event's magnitude, the assessment will conclude that the main rupture released most of the strain efficiently, with a quieter aftershock sequence to follow. Each of these outcomes is possible. The data will decide. A piece of context that the broadcast coverage typically does not include. The aftershock sequence of a major earthquake is not the same thing as a foreshock sequence of a future larger earthquake. Foreshock sequences are statistically rare. Most major earthquakes are followed by smaller aftershocks, not preceded by smaller foreshocks. The probability that the Monday event was a foreshock to an even larger future earthquake is low. The probability that the Monday event was the main shock and that what follows is an aftershock sequence is high. The agencies will treat the sequence as an aftershock sequence by default and revise that interpretation only if the data require it. The 24 to 72 hour window is also the window during which the casualty count typically rises. The 41 confirmed dead at the end of the first day is the count from the structures search crews have reached. As crews reach more damaged structures, additional bodies may be recovered. The count will rise. Some of the 200 plus injured may not survive. The final toll will be determined over the following days and weeks. That is the reality of major earthquake casualty counts. They start at the initial count and grow as the response continues. So here is the question we leave this part with. What will the next update show about aftershock size? You now have the framework for understanding the update. The update will show what the data shows. The data is being collected in real time. The agencies are processing it. The refinements are coming. The next part is about the gap between what the broadcast said and what the data shows, about why the gap exists and what to make of it. Let me show you the warning that was real. Part 10. The warning that was real. Remember the warning we left. The next update will refine the risk. The measurements show the warning was real. The gap in mainstream coverage on Monday was a gap between what the broadcast reported and what the official data showed. The broadcast reported that a tsunami warning was issued. The official data showed that measurable waves arrived at the coasts of 4 countries. Both statements are true. But the broadcast's statement, taken alone, implies that a warning was issued and the wave did not arrive in significant form. The data statement says the warning was issued and the wave did arrive at heights up to 1.4 meters at the peak gauge. The difference between those two framings is the entire story. Why does the gap exist? Not because of conspiracy, not because of deliberate suppression. The gap exists because of institutional caution and the news cycle. Let me show you how each contributes. Institutional caution is the first cause. The warning system is operated by agencies that prioritize accuracy over speed in the final assessment. When a tsunami warning is issued, the warning is based on the modelled wave heights from the rupture parameters. The modelled heights can be conservative, which is to say larger than the eventual measured heights, because erring toward overestimation protects coastal populations. The actual measured heights from the gauges come in over the following hours as the wave passes each station. The measured heights are the truth of the event, but they arrive at the agency in stages. And the consolidated dataset is finalised only after all gauges have reported. That finalisation can take hours to days. The press releases issued during the event focus on the warning status, not on the consolidated measurement set. The measurements are publicly available, but they require a journalist to look them up specifically. The news cycle is the second cause. Mainstream coverage of a major earthquake follows a predictable pattern. The first hour focuses on the magnitude, the location, and the tsunami warning. The second hour focuses on casualty estimates and visible damage from social media and on-scene reporters. The third hour focuses on official statements and the all-clear, if one is issued. The fourth hour and beyond focus on recovery efforts and human interest stories. The wave measurements at distant coasts often fall outside this cycle. They are technical data, requiring expertise to interpret, and they arrive after the broadcast has moved on to the casualty story or the recovery story. The result is that the 4-country reach of the wave is documented in the technical bulletins, but not in the broadcast coverage. Translate that into household terms. Imagine a fire department responds to a structure fire in your neighbourhood. The local news reports that the fire department responded, that the fire was extinguished, and that there were no casualties. The local news does not report that the fire department's water flow data showed the structure required 3,200 gallons of water to extinguish, which is to say nearly twice the volume that a typical structure fire of that footprint requires. The water flow data is publicly available from the fire department. The data is meaningful because it tells you the fire was hotter than typical, or the structure had unusual fuel load, or the response required more resources than normal. But the data is technical, and the news cycle has moved on. The data sits in the records, accurate but unreported. That is the situation with the Monday tsunami measurements. The data is in the records. The data is meaningful. The data tells you that the warning was not just a warning, that the wave was not just a possibility, that the rupture was not just a regional event. The data tells you the rupture pushed water into 4 nations and was measured at gauges in all of them. That is the story the broadcast did not tell you. Not because the broadcast was lying, because the broadcast was operating on a different timescale than the data, a specific named example of how the data is presented in the official record. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center maintains an event page for each tsunami event. The event page lists the source parameters of the earthquake. It lists the threat assessment that was issued. It lists the observed wave heights at gauges that reported during the event. The observed heights for the Monday event include the 1.4 meter peak in Kiamba, the approximately 1 meter heights at multiple Philippine gauges, the 83 centimeter peak in Sulawesi, the 30 centimeter peak in Palau, and the smaller readings at Japanese gauges. The event page is a public document. Any viewer with internet access can read it. The data is not hidden. The data is simply not foregrounded in the broadcast coverage. PHIVOLCS maintains its own bulletin record for the domestic Philippine event. The bulletins list the rupture parameters, the depth refinement, the aftershock sequence in progress, and the tsunami advisory status. PHIVOLCS issues its bulletins in English and in Filipino. They are public documents archived on the PHIVOLCS website. The bulletins are referenced by local Philippine media, but rarely quoted in international broadcast coverage. The USG's Earthquake Hazards Program maintains the global event page, which lists the magnitude, location, depth, focal mechanism, and intensity data for the Monday event. The page is updated as new data arrives. The page is the canonical reference for the seismic parameters of the event. Major news outlets reference this page, often without naming it, when they cite the magnitude and depth. The three official sources, working together, produce a complete record. The complete record shows what happened. The broadcast coverage shows a curated subset of the record. The gap between the complete record and the curated subset is what this part of the script is about. Now that we have the measurements, what does the real event tell us? It tells us that the Philippine Trench region produced a major thrust fault rupture, that the rupture was at the right depth and the right geometry to generate a tsunami, that the tsunami crossed open water at jet speed to reach the coasts of 4 countries, that the alert chain held from Hawaii to the Philippine coast, that the measured wave heights ranged from 30 centimeters in Palau to 1.4 meters at the peak in Kiamba, and that the historical parallel from 1976 reminds us that this fault system has killed 8,000 people in living memory. All of that was available to any broadcaster who knew what to look for. The viewer who watched only the initial coverage saw the warning and the casualty count. The viewer who watched this script has the full event. That is not the story. That is the announcement of the story. The story is the geometry of the rupture, the 4-country reach of the wave, the historical parallel, and the institutional gap that exists between the data and the broadcast. The announcement was the warning. The story is the event the warning was about. A historical parallel for the gap. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake off Japan was reported within minutes of the rupture. The magnitude 9.1 was confirmed quickly. The tsunami warning was issued. The immediate broadcast coverage focused on the Japanese coast. The wave heights at distant gauges across the Pacific, including in Hawaii, in California, in Chile, were measured and recorded. But they entered the broadcast coverage only later, often as a footnote to the main story of the Japanese coastal devastation. The 2011 event was so large that the footnote eventually became its own story, as the cross-Pacific reach was undeniable. The Monday event is smaller. The footnote remains a footnote in the broadcast coverage. But the footnote is the story. The mainstream coverage gap is not unique to this event. It is a systemic feature of how major earthquakes and tsunamis are reported. The broadcast moves fast. The data moves with the precision and pace of the agencies. The gap between them is filled by viewers who are willing to read the bulletins, by journalists who specialize in this kind of reporting, and by analyses like this one. The gap is not closing on its own. The gap is being filled by deliberate work. So here is the question we leave this part with. Now that we have the measurements, what does the real event tell us? You now have the answer in outline. The real event is a major thrust fault rupture in the Philippine Trench region that generated a 4-country tsunami with peak measurements at gauges in the Philippines, Indonesia, Palau and Japan. The next part is about the planetary frame, about the scale of one rupture in geological time and what it means to live near this fault. Let me show you the scale. Part 11, the scale you did not see. Let me show you the scale. 1 quake, 4 countries, and a history that killed 8,000 people. The Monday event is a single event in geological time. From the perspective of the planet, it is a small adjustment in the ongoing process of plate tectonics. From the perspective of the people who lived through it, it is the defining event of the year, the event their children will remember when they speak of childhood earthquakes. the event that will be referenced in disaster preparedness plans in the southern Philippines for the next generation. Both perspectives are correct. Both are simultaneous. The geological scale and the human scale do not contradict each other. They overlap. Let me put the one rupture scale in planetary frame. The Philippine sea plate is being subducted under the Sunda plate at a rate of approximately 80 to 100 millimeters per year. That is the speed of plate convergence in this region. Over 1,000 years, the plates converge by about 80 to 100 meters. Over 10,000 years, the convergence is 800 to 1,000 meters, which is the better part of a kilometer. The Philippine Trench has been forming for tens of millions of years. The total convergence over geological time is hundreds of kilometers. The Monday rupture released a few meters of accumulated slip on the section of the fault that broke. The next rupture, on a different section, will release a few meters more. The total fault system processes hundreds of kilometers of convergence over geological time, in small increments separated by major events. That is the planetary frame. One rupture is one increment in a process that has been ongoing for tens of millions of years and will continue for tens of millions more. The Philippine Trench will keep generating earthquakes for as long as the plates keep moving. The earthquakes will keep generating tsunamis when the geometry is right. The geometry of the Sarangani rupture on Monday was the right geometry. The geometry of the 1976 rupture was the right geometry. The geometry of future ruptures along this fault will sometimes be the right geometry. The cycle continues at the rate of plate motion, slow on human timescales, fast on geological timescales. The household scale comparison. Imagine a clock that ticks once every several decades. Each tick is a major earthquake. The clock has been ticking for millions of years. Most of the people who live near the clock are born, grow up, raise families, and die between two ticks. A few are alive for 2 ticks. A very few are alive for 3. The Monday event was 1 tick. The 1976 event was the previous tick on this section of the fault. The next tick is coming. The clock does not stop. The clock is the plates, and the plates are still moving. Living near this fault, then, means living near a clock that you cannot see, that ticks on intervals you cannot predict, and that produces real-world consequences when it ticks. The southern Philippine population numbers in the tens of millions. The coastline that is exposed to tsunamis from the Philippine Trench region is hundreds of kilometers long. The infrastructure on that coastline is the homes, the businesses, the schools, the hospitals, the ports, the fisheries of those tens of millions of people. The fault is under their feet. The wave can be at their door. The 1976 event killed 8,000. The 2025 event killed 41 at the source and produced measurable waves at 4 countries. The next event is unknown in its parameters, but known in its inevitability. Compare 41 to 8,000. The ratio is about 1 to 200. The difference is the warning system, the building codes, the evacuation procedures, the coastal awareness. Those 4 pieces of infrastructure, built over the decades since 1976, are the reason the Monday event did not produce thousands of coastal deaths. The infrastructure is not free. It costs money to build and maintain. It costs time to train. It costs political attention to keep funded. The cost is paid by national governments, by international cooperation through the PTWC, and by the people themselves who participate in drills and listen to advisories. The cost is paid before the event so that the event does not exact the higher cost. That is the calculus of disaster preparedness. You pay in steady contributions over decades to reduce the cost when the event arrives. The Philippine investment in tsunami preparedness, learnt the hard way from 1976, paid off on Monday. The Indonesian investment in BNPB and the National Alert System paid off in Sulawesi. The Palawan investment in coastal alerts paid off. The international cooperation through the PTWC paid off across all 4 countries. The chain held. The system was funded. The system was practiced. The system held. So here is the question we leave this part with. What does this scale tell us about living near this fault? You now have part of the answer. Living near this fault means living near a slow clock that ticks in major events separated by decades, and means investing in the preparedness infrastructure that turns 8,000 deaths into 41. The next part is the close, the part where we tell you what the rest of the world does not yet know about the Monday event. Let me give you the pattern recognition. Part 12, the pattern recognition gift. Let me tell you what the rest of the world does not yet know. This was not just a warning, it was a real cross-ocean tsunami event tied to a 33-kilometre deep-thrust fault rupture along the Philippine Trench region, with measured wave peaks of 4 meters in Kiamba, approximately 1 meter at multiple Philippine coastal gauges, 83 centimeters off Sulawesi in Indonesia, 30 centimeters in Palau, and recorded readings at Japanese gauges further across the Western Pacific. The general coverage said a warning was issued. The data shows the warning was real, and the wave that arrived was measured by instruments calibrated to international standards in 4 nations. The 4 measured wave heights are not estimates. They are gauge readings. The 1.4 meter peak is the gauge at Kiamba town, on the southwestern coast of Mindanao, recorded continuously by an instrument designed to capture exactly this kind of event. The 1 meter reading is the general height across multiple Philippine coastal stations, with Kiamba as the maximum and other stations recording slightly lower peaks. The 83 centimeter reading is the gauge off Sulawesi in Indonesia, recorded after the wave crossed the Celebes Sea in approximately 2 hours. The 30 centimeter reading is the gauge in Palau, recorded after the wave crossed the broader Philippine Sea. The Japanese gauges added further readings at smaller amplitudes as the wave continued across the Western Pacific. 4 heights. 4 countries. 1 rupture. The broadcast told you a tsunami warning was issued. That is not the story. Is the waves actually hit 4 countries. The pattern you now hold is this. A magnitude 7.8 offshore thrust fault rupture at 33 kilometers depth along the Philippine Trench region subduction system generated a transoceanic tsunami that was measured at gauges in the Philippines, Indonesia, Palau, and Japan. The historical parallel from 1976 reminds us that this fault system has killed 8,000 people in a single night, and that the difference between 8,000 deaths and 41 deaths is the warning infrastructure built over the decades between the 2 events. The next 24 to 72 hours will refine the depth, the aftershock size, and the remaining coastal risk. The fault system remains active. The plates are still moving. The clock will tick again. What you now know that the evening news did not give you is the geometry of the event. You know that thrust faulting moves seafloor upward. You know that 33 kilometers depth is shallow enough to translate that movement to the water above. You know that bays focus tsunamis, which is why Kiamba peaked at 4 meters while other Philippine coasts peaked closer to 1 meter. You know that the wave travelled at the speed of a passenger jet across thousands of kilometers of open ocean to reach 4 nations. You know that the warning system, despite the gaps in the broadcast coverage, held at every coast where it was needed. You know that the 1976 Moro Gulf event is the historical baseline against which this event is measured, and that the difference in casualty count between the 2 events is the difference between an unprepared coast and a prepared one. You also know what to look for the next time a major offshore earthquake is reported. Magnitude alone does not tell you the tsunami risk. Depth matters. Rupture type matters. Source location matters. A magnitude 8 strike-slip earthquake produces a smaller tsunami than a magnitude 7.5 thrust earthquake at the right depth. A deep earthquake at 200 kilometers produces a smaller tsunami than a shallow earthquake at 30 kilometers, even at the same magnitude. The next time you see a major offshore earthquake reported, the questions you can ask are these. What was the depth? What was the focal mechanism? Where were the gauges? And what did they read? Those three questions take you past the headline and into the data. Those three questions are the gift this event gave you. The data is public. The agencies are real. The PTWC posts its bulletins. The USGs posts its event pages. Fivolks posts its domestic advisories. You do not need to be a seismologist to read these documents. You need only to know that they exist and to be willing to look. The broadcast coverage will give you the warning. The data will give you the event. The two together will give you the truth of what happened, which is more than either gives you alone. The 41 dead from the Monday event are real people who lived in General Santos City and across Sarangani province. They are mourned by their families. The 200 plus injured are real people who are recovering in hospitals across southern Mindanao. The 8,000 dead from 1976 are remembered in the historical record of the Philippines as one of the worst single-night losses to a natural disaster in the country's modern history. Each number is a person. Each person is a story that ends or continues based on whether the warning reached them in time. The infrastructure that protects them costs money and attention. The infrastructure that fails them costs lives. The question we opened with is now answered. The tsunami from this single quake reached shores in the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, and Palau. And the 4-meter peak in Kiamba tells us the seafloor shifted upward and pushed the water above it outward.